Starting this morning, as I often do, this is the infrared satellite imagery valid as of this morning here. And what we're doing here, it's always important to remember, like, what actually is being measured here? What is the map that we're looking at? Often there's lessons there, even 10, 15 years into a meteorological career. One, it is just interpreting sensible heat or infrared radiation on the spectrum. That's all that satellite's doing. So we have to kind of interpret the rest of it on our own just by like pattern recognition. And so one thing we're doing with that here is if I look in Louisiana, Mississippi, well, this looks like thunderstorms. Well, why do we say that? Well, because they're very cold cloud tops. In fact, the coldest returns on this map are down here. And it typically takes, a strong thunderstorm updraft to, lift clouds well into the upper atmosphere where it's very cold, or they're going to start to reflect back to that very cold temperature up to the satellite above it. So we can assume that we have some convection and thunderstorms here. Now, the color bar, so these like red and black colors here, it's reversed. So those red and black colors going up on the color bar are actually colder temperatures. So again, kind of what are we interpreting here? We also see some high clouds, and we can tell they're high clouds because they're a little bit colder, that green color streaming into the northwest. There's that kind of northwest flow that we've been talking about. There'll be some systems coming along this, kind of cutting through the country here that we'll have to talk about. And another thing we're watching, look in the Midwest. First, these kind of low clouds. We can tell they're low clouds because they're warmer than here, and they're warmer than these convective cloud tops. So that tells us they're warmer, but warm is kind of a misleading name because it's lake effect snow. And lake effect snow is very shallow as an atmospheric phenomenon relatively. And so we can see that there. And then look at the Midwest. This isn't a cloud. Those are those very cold ground temperatures. We talked about this on Tuesday. Like the coldest air here is here up in the Canadian Shield up here and over here in the Midwest. But when I say cold air, I'm also kind of interpreting that. This isn't actually measuring the air temp. It's measuring the sensible heat coming off the ground. So it just tells us that it's likely air that has settled in overnight that's cooling off that ground so quickly. So it's kind of fun to put that all together here this morning, looking at infrared with the sun not up yet. We can look at the visible. We might see it over here. Yeah, there's that sunrise just coming on shore in the eastern time zone there. If we look at the current temperatures here this morning, sure enough, kind of right where we looked at that infrared satellite imagery, lining up very well. Those coldest temperatures, man, down to like -11 through much of Wisconsin, very cold. Iowa not as cold, and Illinois not as cold as the forecast. So number of forecasts earlier this week had this corridor getting down into like -2, -3, Iowa like down to -10, and it's been a little bit warmer. The Des Moines Heat Island playing a role here. I'm sure we're down into the negatives in like northern Iowa here, but nonetheless, still a little bit warmer than originally forecast. This little blip here, that is either that big lake, I forget the name of it, maybe the Twin Cities. Sometimes when you get a kind of a warm observation in here, it throws off the mapping interpolation a bit. So that's probably what you're seeing there. In fact, you might be able to see it on that infrared. It's always kind of cool to see. Yeah, so it might be one of these warm lakes, or even if you look closely, the Twin Cities have kind of a heat island effect that's showing up there. And there's the Des Moines one as well. Chicago easily stands out with that heat island being a bigger city. Now that warm up, relative to the forecast for Iowa and Illinois, it might be relevant for tomorrow morning. Those temperatures for tomorrow morning expected down into the single digits across northern Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, all the way over to New York and New England. Might not be quite as cold as forecast, given that, initially over Iowa and Illinois here this morning, it was a little bit warmer. Sometimes that that model error actually advects with the system east. That sounds kind of silly to say, but it does do that sometimes. So maybe not quite this cold tomorrow morning, but nonetheless still expecting, temperatures in the single digits, if not the low teens, for a wide swath here across the Midwest and New England here this morning. Starting to warm back up in the upper Midwest and the northern plains. Jump over and look at the continental U.S. radar, just all the states here. One, we can see that convection that we talked about in Louisiana, Mississippi, some needed rains there in the southern Mississippi River Valley. Oklahoma, North Texas, some showers there. A lot of those coming down as snow here this morning. They're kind of right around that freezing line, but last I checked, a lot of that falling as snow and some stronger kind of mixed rain showers there in North Texas. Some showers in the northwest, and then the lake effect showers that we saw toward the northeast and the upper Midwest there. I did look over at traffic here this morning, not too much in the way of disruptions here in the southern plains. So it is snowing, but not enough to affect traffic yet. And kind of scanning around, I don't see anywhere else dealing with too much wintry weather. Of course, it's morning 7:30 here Eastern time zone in the Metro East. So those are just rush hour traffic, unfortunately. Look at the all hazards here this morning. Got winter storm watches up for the Rockies, which is good news. Talked on Tuesday. Eric mentioned this yesterday, the slow start to the year they've had with respect to snowfall. Winter weather advisories out for the panhandle of Texas, central Oklahoma, where we saw those snow showers falling here this morning. Again, didn't see terribly too much impacts from that, but rush hours here are going to be starting in just a little bit. And then winter weather advisories out for North Carolina and Virginia. The rainfall in the low pressure system, albeit a weak one, associated with that early rain here this morning in Mississippi, Louisiana, that's going to be cutting up tomorrow into the mid-Atlantic, bringing some wintry mix, some accumulating snow to that corridor there, and then quite a bit of rain to the Carolinas as well. I did want to mention one last thing before I jump to the next, is we do have some freeze warnings out and cold weather advisories for the Sierra foothills, and those kind of white contours there, and kind of the Paso area, and wind advisories. Some Santa Ana wind for Los Angeles here. Again, wildfire threat this December significantly reduced thanks to the rainfall that we've had in October and November. But one consequence of that rainfall and moisture that California is dealing with, Eric mentioned it, the Thule fog. It's just settled in quite a bit here early this winter. That's a consequence of all that rainfall we've had to start the year, just kind of settling into the Central Valley and the shrubbery, etc. If we look at the upper level wind speeds here this morning, I did want to mention that kind of blip here over Louisiana. It doesn't show much in the way of a trough here, and that's kind of going to be the theme of this talk, with less momentum, less these long wave troughs kind of moving through. There's not as much to kind of see, I think, in some of these jet stream level maps. I'll show you that in just a minute here as we walk through the forecast, but there is kind of a weak trough developing here. This is going to be moving across the country west to east. That's going to be influencing that Carolina event, and then embedded in this northwest flow, you can kind of see it, these little kinks here in the line, these like little shortwave troughs. There's kind of one here as well. These are going to be funneling over and bringing some of these clipper systems across the upper Midwest, some of these sneaking through, maybe the Midwest proper, and bring some snow chances kind of this corridor here. We'll look at that, how they kind of wrap up in the east as well. I did want to jump over and show the 3-kilometer NAM forecast precip here this morning. Let me make this valid about when I'm recording this, kind of near 7 a.m. Central. There's that rainfall and convection that we talked about, those snow showers across Oklahoma. Play this forecast forward through this evening. Look at the rain over spreading Mississippi, roughly the whole state, into southern Tennessee, Alabama. Overnight starts to shift into the Tennessee Valley, over into Georgia and the South Carolina. This is now midnight Central Time, and heavy snow now pushing up into the Appalachians. Starting to get snowfall across Virginia. Northern North Carolina, some question mark as to whether this is going to be mixed, I think. And then by Friday morning, snow now falling across much of Virginia and maybe far northern North Carolina, where we saw those winter weather advisories in the northern counties. Rain to the south of that through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, getting a healthy dose of rain here in an area that we're still concerned about for seasonal drought heading through the west of this winter. So it's going to be nice to get this rainfall in there. While I was talking about that, we saw rain come into the Pacific Northwest. Some of these clipper systems coming through the Rockies. Talked about the winter weather advisories and the winter storm watches posted there. I'm going to play this back a little bit. See one of these clipper systems here coming through this evening through the upper Midwest. Lake effect snow kind of on the back side of these. That ramps up again. And then taking this all the way out now Saturday. See some light snow showers now entering the picture over the Central Plains, and the system kind of moving through eastern Canada here. As far as the next kind of 60 hours of precip go, you don't see much in Virginia and North Carolina. It's going to be hard to get like appreciable snowfall accumulations without a little bit more just moisture getting to the ground here. So not expecting widespread, significant snowfall in this area here, but enough to coat the ground, make it look pretty wintry there. Heavier rains to the southeast, and then quite a bit of moisture coming to the northwest. A lot of this falling is snow in the upper elevations, but the Willamette Valley, Seattle, Tacoma area, looking at rain over the next kind of 50 to 60 hours here. I will mention that same kind of corridor I started out with this video, that area there, drier. And that's going to be a theme that I'm going to keep an eye on as we go through the forecast here. If we look at snowfall, sure enough, from the 3-kilometer NAM, looking at anywhere from like half an inch, maybe up toward like 2 or 3 inches here across Virginia and North Carolina. You can get a little bit higher than that in the mountains here, maybe up over 4 inches, but by and large, not a significant snowfall event. Also can see those clipper systems sneaking through the upper Midwest. Again, not seeing significantly high snowfall values here outside of the Rockies and the lake effect snow corridors. Look at the 500 millibar height pattern. This is just the ECMWF ensemble here this morning. You're not going to see too much. And I mentioned this just a minute ago. I'm going to play this forward through Thursday. That system that we talked about, kind of cutting through on Friday. It's really kind of hard to see. You can see the steep trough here over the Hudson. Kind of the two features I'm keeping an eye on are the Hudson Bay Trough and this western U.S. ridge. We play this forward. We still see little systems sneaking through. This is Saturday. There's one there. I know, it's like almost hard to see. And then by Sunday, that's sneaking through the southeast. We'll look at the rainfall and the snow in just a second. We still see this ridge parked here. Now that Hudson Bay Trough over here, kind of near Newfoundland, eastern Canada. Another little system now sneaking through on Monday and Tuesday through the Midwest. Can just kind of infer these aren't going to be terribly strong, not widespread weather makers, but that sneaks through. And then a lot of the models, GFS and the ECMWF, by Tuesday into Wednesday, starts to show a little bit of a stronger system cutting down into the Midwest and the eastern U.S., and then we still have this trough here. But what we've lost over this 7-day forecast is that deep Hudson Bay Trough. It's now just kind of weaker. A piece of it went this way. There's a piece of it now here over the Midwest, and this western U.S. ridge has remained. If I play the forecast forward, without that deep Hudson Bay Trough and this trough kind of exiting east next weekend, we're pretty far out in the forecast here, finally allows this ridge to establish over the central U.S. And this is kind of the brief warm-up Eric and I have been talking about. Now, I'm all the way 250 hours out. If I do take it further, just for the heck of it, why not? It starts to break down by December 17th, and perhaps we go back into the similar pattern that I started the video with something like that. But at least next weekend, not this weekend, but next, like Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, up to the 16th, trying to get a brief warm-up in here and maybe a break, kind of the rinse and repeat cycle that Eric mentioned. We might see the kind of quote-unquote warmer phase of that by mid-December. It's still seeing some flow west. Now, another piece of that I want to mention is as that ridge starts to establish, especially like Sunday into Monday, this trough starts to get a little bit deeper out west. It has been kind of holed up here, but if we can get ridging here upstream of that, we often have a trough, and that might allow California to get on some of that better jet stream level flow. I don't think we're going to get into Southern California, maybe even Central, but at least like the northern third. See if we can get it down to the San Francisco metro area. So it's something to watch as we go through next week. Now, I do want to play the precip forecast out from the ECMWF. I'm going to do this quickly. There's that brief snowfall that we talked about, North Carolina, Virginia. ECMWF has actually trended a little bit stronger with this, kind of in line with the NAM, 1 to 3 inches. Earlier this week had that a little bit weaker. Heavier system moving into the Pacific Northwest on Friday. That weak clipper that we talked about moving through the upper Midwest and Canada. Just going to the weekend. Heavier snow falling here over the Canadian Rockies, Montana, Prairie, and the Plains. Now this cuts across on Saturday. This was one of those little systems. It was almost hard to see on the 500 millibar height pattern. Continuing to see precip through the weekend for the Willamette Valley, Seattle, Tacoma area, Cascades getting some heavy snowfall. Obviously British Columbia, the coastal range there. A little bit of snow sneaking through the Midwest, but not much. Continued rainfall coming for the southeast through the weekend. And then another system here now Monday. This is one of those small ones that didn't really show up. I'm going to head back to the Pacific Northwest for a second. Now Tuesday morning, still seeing heavy rain there. Here's that low cutting across the Great Lakes region. And then I mentioned by Tuesday to Wednesday, we had a stronger system, stronger with quotes because it's not, one of these deep southwest flow systems. That's cutting in now on the 10th. Play that forward. Do see some rain across the Midwest. Snow line kind of near I-80 and north. But even that, that isn't the strongest winter storm that we've seen this year. So even that being our strongest storm doesn't say much as that cuts through the eastern U.S. late next week. And that's getting closer to that warm-up. Our last clipper system comes through on Friday. And then I mentioned California, the chance for some of this flow to get all the way down in here. Southern Oregon, Northern California, maybe getting some rainfall all the way down to the Central Valley. And rain across the Midwest with that deeper warm-ups. With that ridge spreading here, we get moisture, we get heat moving up into the middle part of the country. Now I'm going to stop the forecast here. I can't even say if this low is going to develop, but that potential, for a warmer system to come through, maybe with more rainfall into that corridor that had been drying out, starts to show up as we get toward mid-December, potentially some California precip as well. Now the kind of agreement is that likely on the other side of this warm-up, we probably flip back into a similar system. At least that's Eric and I's thinking right now. I strongly agree with his assessment that he talked through yesterday. I'll tell you why in just a second. That's the general pattern that we've seen. Now the GFS, Eric mentioned all the differences yesterday morning. I've seen the model updates. The ECMWF actually caved in a few pieces here and there toward the GFS, and they look pretty similar to my eye initially, and then even next week. I'm going to do this quickly. We already walked through the ECMWF, which is on the right side of your screen, but the GFS, is actually now shifting a little bit weaker for the Friday snowfall. Not, significantly. Has that similar clipper system, and I apologize, the GFS on these very light precip values struggles with the precipitation type, but this is all falling as snow. What you see is like a light rain up here in Montana. These just light values, it struggles to shift over to that blue color there. Pretty similar through Saturday. ECMWF maybe a little bit lighter with some of this precip moving through the southeast, but again, that like nitpicking, some slight differences on this clipper. ECMWF has it a little further north. Again, this is all coming down as snow over Iowa and Illinois here on Sunday. Generally dissipates that at about the same time. Has the Pacific Northwest, heavier precipitation. There's that next wave coming through on Tuesday. ECMWF has it a little bit more defined, but given that we're 4 to 5 days out, pretty decent agreement between the two. And then even has this next wave on Wednesday, well out into the forecast now. Almost a week out, almost in the exact same spot over northern Iowa, Minnesota. Slight differences. The GFS is a little bit quicker. And again, much of this falling as snow here Wednesday. As that cuts through, just pretty good agreement across the board all the way 7 days out now. I mean, just slight differences in timing. I'll notice the ECMWF is a little bit stronger with these systems as it cuts through, the GFS a little bit weaker. And then you don't really see a major difference till we get way out toward next weekend, like Friday. And then the ECMWF starts picking up on maybe a clipper that I can't find in the GFS. But the GFS also has that warm up spreading into the central US as we get out toward next weekend with that rainfall heading further south into California. Maybe the ECMWF a little bit further south initially. The GFS showing that as well. And then even that low. I'm all the way out like 10 days. We have this Lee cyclone here over western Oklahoma, and I'm seeing one show up here from the GFS, albeit a little bit weaker. So actually pretty remarkable model agreement between those two all the way out now, about 2 weeks. The one difference that does show up, I mentioned the Euro was a little bit stronger with these clipper systems moving through, so we see a better appreciable snow swath anywhere from like Alberta, looking at 4 to 6 inches all the way across that lake effect corridor through areas like Madison, Wisconsin, through Detroit, toward like Syracuse, New York. If I jump over and show you the GFS, you'll notice much weaker in that corridor, but still the same general look with the flow as we talked about coming up and over like that. If we look at the 10-day departures from averages for precipitation, this is starting with the ECMWF, and that corridor shows up very nicely that I talked about earlier. Just the last 48 hours that have been dry shows up again over the next 10 days. And even some of the areas here with those winter weather advisories, North Carolina, South Carolina, portions of the southern Mississippi River Valley. So want to watch this area here and toward California because unfortunately I've seen a lack of rainfall starting to pick up here as we've entered winter proper, at least late November for the Southwest, California, and the Sierras. Getting some moisture in here late next weekend, but that's more so on the northern side of the state. If we go over the GFS, again, slight differences here between the two. GFS a little bit further south, just generally with the flow, at least across portions of the Colorado Rockies, but I mean, ECMWF again a little bit stronger with those clipper systems as they come out onto the plains, but decent agreement between the two. Look at the long range with respect to temperatures. You're going to see left to right on this map a lot of similarities in that the temperature pattern is not changing as much, even with that warm up in kind of the mid to long range. I mentioned that like out next week. And we look in that time period. Here's the ECMWF ensemble. Here's the GFS and the ECMWF AIFS. At least the AIFS brings some warmth all the way over into the southeast, but you'll notice this area here, despite that ridging, never really goes over that much more. Maybe the AIFS a little bit here. So even with that, ridging trying to get out in the middle part of the country, a lot of that heat stays either over the southwest or over Texas and Louisiana. It's like as far east as it really gets, save for maybe the AIFS and the far long range. So part of this is that snowpack that's settled in over this area here. In the central U.S., that's resisting some of that heat that's trying to push in later in December. I say heat, I really just mean, mild for December standards. But even in the long range, there is plenty of that reservoir of cold air. The Canadian prairie getting a lot of snowfall in the next 7 days. In fact, we'll jump back, show you that ECMWF snowfall forecast. I mean, that's plenty of cold air in the long range ready to come out into the central U.S. And then we already have that snowpack setting up here over the Midwest. I think it's just kind of resisting that warm up. I do want to mention, I'll pull this down a little bit. If we look in the long range, like the 8 to 14 day forecast, Again, starting to see that ridge set up here, but that keeps the flow still in that general look that we've seen. So even with that ridge starting to set up here, it just means that flow shifts a little bit to the north. But the agreement from Eric and I, and then some of the long range models, as we go from out in the long range here, where the flow looks something more like this, to probably something more like that afterwards by late December. And it's not too big of a change with respect to where the precipitation corridor is here. That's still that same area of concern that I had exists on this map, even shifting a little bit toward the southeast. I do want to mention the CPC out in long range. They have identified the northwest, pretty understandably so, for a high wind risk, especially kind of the front range here, and then the prairie and plains to the east of that. With all that flow and those storms coming around, plenty of low pressure systems, pressure gradient force, and then the mountains as well for some of these higher wind events that we'll have to keep an eye on. I do want to jump over and show you the AFS quickly here, kind of getting toward the end of this video, but I'm going to play this out quickly because the AFS is often helpful to look at in the long range to see if it picks up on kind of a realistic pattern change scenario. I'm taking it all the way out into our warm-up. Here's Sunday, December 14th. Actually brings that ridge all the way over the central U.S. This is helping to get that warmth all the way through the southeast. We saw in the long range that this area is going to resist this warm-up with that snowpack, but this would be enough to start melting some of it, especially if we can get rainfall on it, as some of the models have suggested. We've lost that Hudson Bay trough. We now have a trough out west. This would be, I think, beneficial for California if it comes to fruition. This is all kind of a hypothetical because I'm all the way here at 240 hours. If I play this forecast forward, though, you'll notice it reverts back to that ridging out west, troughing to the east. Eric mentioned this rinse and repeat where here comes that northwest flow again, systems coming around, potential nor'easter out as we go toward late December into that kind of holiday stretch there. So that's the next change that we're looking for, that potential switch back toward that familiar pattern. Now, another kind of feather in the cap of that scenario, Eric mentioned this yesterday, we still have the displaced stratospheric vortex. In fact, a lot of the cold that we've seen over the last week or so, even here this morning, likely isn't even connected to the current polar vortex disruption. That's kind of the stratospheric polar vortex disruption. Kind of interesting to think about that. It just kind of coincidentally, I think, lined up. I think, if this stratospheric polar vortex disruption where it shifted way over Siberia and Europe rather than over the North Pole, which would be more like there, if this is going to influence a cold air outbreak, it's going to happen later in December, kind of in line with what that AIFS showed. Now, is the AIFS showing, exactly that scenario? I can't tell you that for sure. The dynamics are too complex to be able to pick up just on one model run. But I don't know if this is necessarily responsible for the recent cold. I think its influence still beckons later in December. And jumping over, Eric mentioned this yesterday too. I'm just kind of reiterating that as we see this MJO transition through phase 8 and phase 1, it's starting to come back to null space. And I was looking at the Hofmullers kind of in a different way that maybe Eric was. I'll do that in just a second. But part of me wonders is as this enters null space, if it doesn't pop back out somewhere over here. So we're not seeing it come all the way across. We're kind of seeing the forecast take it down here, especially toward late December. If not in January, we pop back out at some point. La Nina has been weakening. That continues to be the case. We're actually up over -1 Celsius in an anomaly. We might stay that way because if we look at the trade winds over the Central Pacific, seeing if anything westerly wind anomalies, which are not conducive to La Nina strengthening. If anything, this should weaken La Nina further as we go through the month of December. If I look well out into the forecast, like December 17th and beyond, you can start to see some trade wind activity here. But that might be that MJO starting to pick back up here somewhere over phase 4 or 5. We have some substance here in phase 8 that tends to push it back over phase 4 or 5. So keeping an eye on that potential rinse and repeat pattern as we get into late December here that Eric mentioned yesterday. It's kind of interesting to see. This wasn't here when I talked with you all on Tuesday, but it's so far on the forecast. Don't want to put too much weight into it now. I'm just going to be watching this kind of trade wind burst, not necessarily for its impact on La Nina, but it might help to kick the MJO back up on the other side of that phase diagram that I just showed you there. Another way of kind of looking at the long-range outlook, Eric showed this, I think, in a different way with a different map. I honestly don't know what website he was on. I'll have to look at that. I can actually find it here. This is kind of an interesting way to see the long-range pattern over North America. We're looking at, again, one of these Hofmuller diagrams, so to kind of orient us. This is present day, this black line. Going up on this ridiculous chart is going back in time, and going down is into the forecast. And what you're looking at here is the longitude. So the blue colors are upper level troughs over this stretch of latitude across the globe. And so really I'm focused on North America for the respects of this video. So I'm focused on this corridor here. And what we can see here over the last 2 weeks and over the next week is we've had ridging, and this lines up with the map below. So we've had ridging across the west coast of the US, and that has kept necessarily troughing across the east coast in the forecast. And this is consistent with that cold air that we've seen in the forecast here, and relatively drier weather over California, and warmer conditions there, and then the flow coming out over the top of that ridge there. So as we look into the forecast, this stays pretty consistent. That trough moves slightly to the east as that Hudson Bay trough exits to the east, and so that cold kind of starts to push a little bit east. We actually see a little bit of a warm-up with that ridge moving more so over the middle part of the country. We looked at that, if you remember. But again, looking way out into the forecast, kind of after the 17th, that troughing maybe starts to sneak back into the middle part of the country. And this ridge here starts to weaken over like the southwest and maybe pushes off more toward the Pacific. So interesting to see that. And what's odd about this is that, well, I shouldn't say odd, what's maybe expected about this is while these little troughs here tend to move west to east, and we can see that in the past, maybe west to east across the Pacific, sometimes west to east quickly across the eastern US, you can kind of see that there. The broader, like long wave trough, those like big troughs that define the pattern, those big ridges that Eric mentioned out west, those actually move east to west with time, very slowly, almost kind of imperceptible in like a 7-day forecast. And what's kind of neat about this is you can see this here over Asia. You see this ridge, like this large ridge that settled in late November. If you actually like draw it out, like it's been moving this way, east to west, slowly. And then this troughing here generally over the Western Pacific has also generally been moving east to west. Now there's all these little troughs kind of embedded in it, and those actually move west to east, but the much broader pattern moves east to west via Rossby wave characteristics. And you can almost see one here across North America. I can almost draw one like that. You see that there? And if I kind of draw this out toward like late December, does that mean that this trough is heading over the central US, versus more the eastern US in late December? That would be intense for a late December forecast for like the middle part of the country, rather than just like the Midwest and East. Something to think about. Some old dynamics textbooks are calling to me from like college days. I'm going to keep an eye on that, and you're going to do it with me next week, so we'll look at that. I think I had a few more slides here. Eric showed the weeklies yesterday. I'm not seeing a big change here this morning. I'm going to gloss over these pretty quick, but I am kind of noticing a little bit more rainfall here, trying to get into that 30-day forecast. This actually takes us all the way out to January 17th. Much too far to talk specifics here, but watching California to see, are they really going to stay dry through the heart of winter? Some hints that we might get a little bit better flow into this corridor here, but not necessarily Southern California or the Sierras, unfortunately. And then the Carolinas in the southeast. Climate Prediction Center removed some of the drought concern here, but I'm not totally sold. We have the rain coming through in the forecast. We've had some over the last 48 hours, but with that drier long-range forecast that I showed earlier, see if I have that up, some of that dryness stretching back into that area there. I'm going to be watching that pretty closely as we go through this winter. If we look at the 30-day temperature forecast from the ECMWF extended, this is from the 16th of December through the 15th of January, kind of looking at that long range. Still plenty of cold air here with all the snowfall and a route to move into the northern tier of the country. What I don't see is that scenario that I just mentioned, where that deep winter trough comes over this area and makes this whole area go over colder and wintry, more coherently. So keep an eye on the two scenarios as we go forward, but man, I'm watching that. Just the old dynamics playbook would say that, maybe that keeps moving east to west. I'll talk with you all next week. Eric will talk with you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.